I had been working at the company for about 5 years, climbing the corporate ladder steadily. I was proud of my job, and despite the long hours and occasional stress, I genuinely enjoyed what I did. My colleagues were supportive, and the office environment, though competitive, was one where I managed to thrive. But there was one thing that always made me slightly uneasy: our CEO, Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan was one of those leaders who ruled with an iron fist. He was the kind of person who demanded respect but rarely gave it in return. His sharp suits and even sharper tongue made him a formidable presence in the office. People whispered about him behind closed doors, and while I had never been on the receiving end of his notorious rudeness, I had witnessed enough to know that he wasn't someone you wanted to cross. Still, I kept my head down and did my job well, avoiding any direct conflict with him, until the day my partner Alex came to visit me at work. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, and Alex had some free time after an appointment downtown. He offered to pick me up from the office so we could grab lunch together. I was excited for him to meet some of my coworkers. I talked about them often at home, and Alex, being the supportive partner he was, always showed interest in my work life. When Alex arrived, I greeted him in the lobby with a quick hug and a smile. He looked handsome as ever in his casual but well put together outfit: jeans, a button-down shirt, and that effortlessly charming smile. I was proud to introduce him to the people I spent so much of my time with. As we walked through the office, I introduced Alex to a few of my colleagues who were around. They greeted him warmly, shaking his hand and making small talk. Alex was his usual charming self, polite and friendly, asking questions about their work and genuinely engaging in the conversation. It felt good to have him there, to show him off a little. Then we passed by Mr. Donovan's office. His door was open, and as we walked by, he looked up from his desk. I noticed his eyes linger on Alex a little too long. There was something in his expression that made me pause, but I brushed it off, assuming it was just my nerves. I knew Mr. Donovan could be intimidating, but this was my partner. There was nothing to be nervous about, or so I thought. Mr. Donovan stood up and walked over to us. "Ah, this must be the famous partner I've heard about," he said, his voice dripping with a mixture of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. I introduced Alex and they shook hands. But then something unexpected happened. Without missing a beat, Mr. Donovan looked Alex up and down, and with a smirk that made my stomach drop, muttered, "I thought he'd be taller." At first, I thought it was a joke, a very poor, distasteful joke, but a joke nonetheless. I half laughed, trying to brush it off, but the moment I glanced at Alex, I realized he hadn't taken it that way. His face remained calm, but I could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. My heart sank. Alex, always the gentleman, didn't respond immediately. He just smiled politely and said, "Well, I like to think I make up for it in other ways." He was trying to keep the peace, but I could tell he wasn't happy. Mr. Donovan, apparently not one to let things go, chuckled and said, "Well, I suppose everyone has their strengths, even if they aren't obvious." At that moment, the air around us grew tense. I could feel my face heating up, embarrassment and anger swirling inside me. How dare he insult Alex like that? What gave him the right? I wanted to say something to defend my partner, but before I could get a word out, Alex did something I never expected. He looked Mr. Donovan dead in the eye, his smile never wavering, and said in the calmest voice imaginable, "You know, I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Donovan. I expected someone with your reputation to be a little more respectful." The words hung in the air like a challenge. I could see the surprise flash across Mr. Donovan's face, quickly replaced by something darker, anger, perhaps, or maybe just shock that someone had dared to speak to him like that. He wasn't used to being called out, especially not by someone who wasn't even part of the company. I stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Mr. Donovan narrowed his eyes at Alex, clearly trying to decide how to respond. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Alex, still calm as ever, didn't back down. "Respect," he repeated. "It's something I value, especially when it comes to the people I care about." He glanced at me briefly before looking back at Mr. Donovan. "I've always believed that the way you treat others, especially those who work for you, says a lot about who you are as a person." Mr. Donovan's face flushed a deep red, and I could tell he was struggling to keep his composure. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, not by anyone, let alone someone who wasn't an employee. "I think you should leave," he said, his voice strained. Alex nodded. "I think we will." He turned to me and said, "Ready to go?" I was still in shock, but I nodded, too stunned to do anything else. We walked out of the office, leaving Mr. Donovan standing there speechless. As we exited the building, I could feel the eyes of my coworkers on us, though none of them said a word. When we got outside, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "I can't believe you just did that," I said, looking at Alex in awe. He had always been confident, but this was something else entirely. He shrugged, giving me a small smile. "No one insults my partner and gets away with it." I laughed, though part of me was still shaken. "I don't know what's going to happen at work now," I admitted. "Mr. Donovan doesn't take kindly to people standing up to him." Alex reached over and took my hand. "You don't need to worry about him," he said. "People like that thrive on intimidation. But once someone shows them they can't be bullied, they back down. Trust me. And Alex was right. The next day at work, I expected some sort of fallout, maybe even a tense conversation with Mr. Donovan. But instead, things seemed strangely normal. Mr. Donovan avoided me, and though he never apologized, I noticed a shift in how he treated me and, by extension, the people around me. He was more cautious, more restrained, as if Alex's words had left a lasting impression on him. As the weeks went by, I started hearing whispers around the office. Apparently, my coworkers had heard about the incident, and they were quietly impressed. People who had never spoken to me before started stopping by my desk to chat, offering words of support and admiration for how Alex had handled the situation. It seemed that Mr. Donovan's reign of fear had been slightly diminished, at least in the eyes of the employees. One afternoon, a few weeks after the incident, I was in the break room when I ran into Claire from HR. We weren't particularly close, but she had always been kind. She smiled at me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "I heard about what happened with Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice low but conspiratorial. I raised an eyebrow. "You did?" She nodded, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Word gets around. I just wanted to say it was about time someone stood up to him. People are really impressed, you know. Not many people would have the courage to do that." I smiled, though I wasn't sure what to say. "It wasn't really me," I admitted. "It was Alex." "Well, either way, it made an impact," Claire said. "I think Mr. Donovan needed that reality check." As I went back to my desk, I thought about what Claire had said. It was strange to think that something as simple as standing up for myself, or rather having Alex stand up for me, could have such a ripple effect. The tension that had once permeated the office seemed to have lifted, even if only slightly. Mr. Donovan was still Mr. Donovan, but he was no longer untouchable in the way he had once been. Months passed, and life went on as usual. Alex and I didn't talk about the incident much after that day, but every now and then, I'd catch him smiling when I mentioned work. He never needed to say it, but I knew he was proud of the way things had turned out. And as for me, I realized that sometimes standing up to someone, even in the smallest ways, can change everything. I no longer felt intimidated by Mr. Donovan, and while I didn't necessarily expect an apology from him, I knew that I had earned his respect, or at the very least, his caution.